You heard the commonplace saying that if two people agree on absolutely everything, one of them is unnecessary. My wife and I wouldn't be closing in on 50 years of marriage if that weren't true. Multiply the problem on the scale of tens of thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in a critical profession in our country, a free society that will not remain free unless it is an educated, knowledgeable, thoughtful, engaged society of citizens. Hundreds of thousands of people who agree on absolutely everything. How many of them would be unnecessary? That's really the situation, and I don't exaggerate. There is social science statistical survey research to back it up. That is the situation in most of higher education in the United States today as regards the core beliefs about God and man and politics and society and economics, what constitutes the good in human life. A uniformity of sincere, yes, well-intentioned, yes, but dangerously monochrome belief in American higher education among those who teach the next generation of American citizens. Colorado Christian University proudly swims against the tide. We have real intellectual diversity. A handful of other institutions are outstanding across the country. They've got real openness to all ideas, but especially a core conviction that our heritage of Western civilization, coming, we would argue, to its fullest flower in the American story over the last several centuries, has got to be at the center. Hillsdale College in Michigan is another of those. And our guest this evening teaches at Hillsdale College. I'm eager to have you know him. The circumstances of Dr. Bradley J. Burcer being with us at Colorado Christian University this evening stem from the initiative several years ago by leading Colorado citizens and philanthropists in cooperation with President Bruce Benson at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and members of the Regents of the University of Colorado elected by We the People. An initiative to create a visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy, an annually endowed post which started for the first time in the 2013 to 14 academic year, and we were honored to have on our campus the visiting scholar who inaugurated the program, Stephen Hayward, widely admired author and commentator and historian and political scientist, Reagan biographer. I believe he's at Pepperdine these days. He has several distinguished academic appointments, American Enterprise Institute. Stephen Hayward was with us a couple of times on the campus and at Centennial Institute programs last year. And in this, the second year of the program, Dr. Burcer was recruited to take a year from Hillsdale and be in residence at CU Boulder. Now this is good, but think of the significance of needing to appoint a visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at an institution supported by our tax dollars and relied upon by all of us as citizens of Colorado to help prepare the next generation of citizens and leaders, as well as to do the basic research that great universities do, that they pride themselves on diversity. They're not an all-male institution that would need to have a visiting scholar that happened to be a woman. They're not an institution of all one racial complexion that would have to have a visiting scholar of a darker racial complexion. Diversity across the board by many measurements, but not necessarily intellectual diversity. Colorado Christian University has only respect and an amicable regard for our colleagues at the University of Colorado Boulder. Don't mistake me. But it just says something about the situation in American higher education writ large across the land today, that such a post has been established. You have to start somewhere, though, if this is the journey of 1,000 miles towards true intellectual diversity in American higher education, public institutions, private institutions, religious institutions, secular institutions. Then let it begin with one step that's been taken at the University of Colorado Boulder, a step that sadly has not been taken at very many other public institutions anywhere in the 50 states. All hail to the gesture that's been made, the beginning that's been made there. Brad Burcer grew up in Kansas, got his degree at Notre Dame, his undergraduate work, completed his doctorate in history at the University of Indiana, and since 1999 he has taught at Hillsdale College. Just to locate Hillsdale for you in the American intellectual firmament, many people think of it, because of its conservative excellence, as coming on almost to become the CCU of the Midwest. I had the honor to work there years ago. I feel like I'm an honorary Hillsdale alum, and they have been blessed that not just Brad Burcer, but his wife Deirdre, who's with him this evening, both teach there. It's to Colorado's good fortune that they and their 6, you heard me right, 6 children, ages 3 to 15, are spending a year here at the foot of the Rockies in Boulder, and we're very grateful that he can be with us here this evening. He has occupied the Russell Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale. Lots of us revere Russell Kirk as the author of the book, The Conservative Mind, which was so influential on William F. Buckley and others in the 1950s. Russell Kirk, really one of the founders of the modern American conservative movement. Brad Burcer's book on Russell Kirk, a biography, will be out later this year. He's also written acclaimed books on Christopher Dawson and J.R.R. Tolkien. We've asked him to talk tonight about the situation of intellectual diversity in higher education, or the lack of it. I'm sure he's got some interesting stories from us about his experience in half a year so far at Boulder. So this question, must the left control the campuses? We eagerly await, Professor, your encouraging words that it doesn't have to be so. Please welcome Professor Brad Burcer.
Well, thank you very much, John. That was great, and we just had dinner together as well with a number of people and had a really nice time. So I do want to thank John for inviting me, in the Centennial Institute, and of course Colorado Christian. My wife is right back there on the edge there. She kind of waved. We left our 6 kids back in Longmont. Actually, we're hoping that everything's fine. We haven't. We should call in. The oldest is 15, almost 16, but he's actually totally. He's not irresponsible. He's just irresponsible, right? He's probably reading something right now. It's the 13-year-old who's the very responsible one. So hopefully all is going well there. But we haven't heard otherwise. We also, I just want to acknowledge, I've got a number of former students who are here, sitting next to Deidre back there from Hillsdale College, who are working out here in Denver and a couple of other places. Meg is a TV celebrity back there, so you may recognize her from some local shows. And behind them is actually a good friend of mine, Getty, who is working here and drove tonight. And then I found out, this was so exciting, as I was sitting here waiting, this beautiful woman here right in front reached over and said, "You know, your mother's husband is my brother." So this is actually, my father passed away back in 1967, right after I was born, but my mom is remarried, Dawn Feist, and this is his sister here, so that's great. And now that I know that, I mean, actually, she's much better looking, but they do look alike, so that was very exciting. So this is great. So thank you all for coming out tonight. What I would like to talk about, and this question about the left, must it control academia? What I'm really interested in looking at here, especially as an American historian and someone who teaches the great books, is maybe a question that I know the Centennial Institute is very interested in, and John Andrews as well. Is it possible that we can achieve an understanding of the most important questions without appealing to politics? That is, can we look at the questions that are essential without making them left or right? Do we have to make everything political? Is there a possibility of transcending those ideas? And rather than it being Republican, Democrat, or left-right, if it's something more than that. And the reason that we ask this, and this is part of the tax that we've tried to take at Hillsdale, that in order to have a conservative education, you actually have to have a liberal education first. That is, a liberal education in the very traditional understanding of what liberalism means, the idea of being liberated from the things of this world, going back to the ancient Greeks, to Socrates, to Plato and Aristotle, and asking what are the most essential questions that we can consider. What do we need to ask, and how important are those questions? How do those questions allow us to have relations one with another? How do we transcend generational differences? How do we get past, for example, this new thing that Obama has just proposed, the idea of funding these community colleges? Well, that's a big deal, and we get worked up one way or the other about that. Believe me, I've had some arguments already with some friends on Facebook. I had no idea this was going to be controversial. I said, do we really have the money to pay for this? It was amazing how many people, well, are you against the underprivileged getting education? I said nothing of the sort. I said, can we pay for this? That's not the same thing. And it's amazing how quickly we gravitate. We all do this. This is also very American. But we gravitate towards this. Is this an immediate thing? Can we figure this out at the moment? And one of the things that a liberal education attempts to do is to go beyond that and say, well, all right, this is an ephemeral issue, frankly. 100 years from now, it may not matter. 1,000 years, no one is going to remember Obama at all. I mean, it's just not going to be on the radar. And that's the same for Bush, and these people are not, maybe Reagan will be remembered, maybe a few others, but they really, FDR will probably be remembered, but they really, really are going to have to make something that's going to make them have a place in history. Otherwise, 1,000 years from now, assuming that we're still here, that's it's not going to be an issue. So no one is going to be debating the Community College Act of 2015 in Boulder, Colorado, or here in Denver 1,000 years from now. So what are the prime questions then? What do we need to ask? And I don't want to disappoint John, but I actually have no tell-all stories for Boulder. I wish I did. Probably the weirdest thing I've seen in Boulder was some guy dressed up as a chicken. I mean, that's, and I'm sure we all have images of Boulder as this or that. I just haven't had those experiences yet. Nobody has read me the Riot Act. Nobody's challenged me in any kind of disrespectful way. In fact, the only thing that probably came close to it, this was a great privilege. I got to host the debate between the congressional candidates there in Boulder, and between Ling and Paulus, and I guess some of the students thought that I was favoring Ling, which was actually not true. I had no idea who was on whose side. I was just asking questions, but one student got very, very agitated, and I thought was about to get violent. Actually calmed down. But other than that, and that's, I think we can chalk up, no offense to anyone, I think we can chalk that up to more being a male at age 18 than anything else. So I'm not sure there was really a left-right division there. What I've noticed at Boulder, and I'm hoping this is true elsewhere as well, is energy everywhere. Just an incredible intellectual curiosity about things. And there's no doubt that when I walk into some place and I'm introduced, this is our visiting professor of conservative thought, it's as though I do have this huge kind of three-dimensional C right on my forehead, a scarlet letter. But what I always get, people come up, really? Well, what does that mean? What do you believe? You like Republicans? That's, and nothing beyond that, right? And it really has not been anything more than that, more just a curiosity. And I always try to explain, well, there are a lot of schools of thought. In some areas, I come from a more philosophical tradition. In other areas, I'm much more libertarian. And it usually opens up all kinds of debates. And pretty soon we find out that on a lot of things, war, military, we actually have quite a bit in common, which is not quite what I expected. So it's been a really interesting development, I think, at least for me in my academic career, to see this. So what I would like to do tonight, thinking about this question, does the left have to dominate? Which it does. I don't think there's any question about that. I think the question we want to ask is, how seriously do they dominate, and what kind of intellectual capital do they bring to things? Now, this would be as much a danger for those of us on the right as those of us who are not on the right. I think one of the main problems with having any kind of group is that you're going to get groupthink after a while, and especially if you're not being challenged. And that's essentially what we have now. When I talk to an average professor, and this is not to knock anyone in personally, but when I ask them about their political beliefs, it's always this kind of mush. It's kind of just a tapioca leftism. There's nothing really interesting about it. It's not really based on theory. It's not based on any idea except this is where I fall. This is what I believe. Everyone else kind of believes that too. And there's a real conformity. That I find extremely dangerous. And it wouldn't matter where that came from. But that idea that we can't think beyond this, or that we all have these particular assumptions, that is what I find very, very troubling. And I personally, now, as John said, I grew up in Kansas, and I grew up in a very strong Goldwater household, and I grew up in a conservative town in Hutchinson, and I had a lot of great teachers around me, a lot of really great people, amazing people, especially as I look back now and think about those people who shaped me. But the one thing, and I think this is true, I'm 47, and I think this is true for a lot of people my generation, the one thing I resented were those former leftists from the 60s who wanted to mold me in their image. That's why I became a libertarian and a conservative. Not just because my mom was very influential on me, but not just because of my mom, but because I really, and there was a lot of anger there, I really resented these people telling me how to think, telling me how to live, telling me how to do this or that, where I realized that they had no hardcore belief in it either, except they liked the fact that they had this kind of authority. And that, to me, at least growing up in Kansas, it always felt very clear to me that the left really loved its authority. And I'm not sure that would be different if we had the right in charge, but I do know that there is, and I've seen that here as well in Colorado, there is that strong streak of individualism, which I think is very, very healthy. And it's an interesting individualism. I think about my mother's husband, I think about my uncles, I think about my aunts. You know, they did their own thing, but the moment the neighbor needed help, they put whatever their own thing was down, and they helped their neighbor. I've seen that in Colorado, I've seen that in Kansas, that's clear in Nebraska. You know, there's an ethic there that I appreciate. It's not the individualism of damn everybody else. It's the individualism of let me do what I need to do, and of course we'll help everybody. There's a respect there. There's an immense respect, and that I've appreciated strongly here in Colorado. So tonight, this was great. John and I had talked about me coming last fall, and that would have been great, but I was also very, very glad when I found out that we were going to move it to this year. And the reason why, it's gimmicky, but the reason why is because this year, here in 2015, is the 60th anniversary of one of my favorite books, a book Russell Kirk wrote. John introduced him to you. Great figure. He was the main figurehead behind Barry Goldwater. He was not the main one behind Reagan, but certainly was one of them. And really, we consider, I think, Kirk justly as the founder of post-war conservatism, writing his book 1952, coming out in 1953, The Conservative Mind. But in 1955, he released a book called Academic Freedom, an essay in definition. And it was a very deep analysis of what is academic freedom and what does it mean? What is its significance for us? And how do we approach that? Not as left or right, but as humanity. How do we approach this special thing which we call academic freedom? And a lot of the terms he uses, I think, are probably out of fashion. But here we are on the 60th anniversary of this book, and I want to read just a little bit, not the whole book, but I want to read just a little bit to you of what he argued in 1955. And let me put a little bit behind this as well. Kirk was, as one person wrote, he was probably the most individualist, anti-individualist of the 20th century. He is the kind of person that you could only have come up and be raised in America. A strong individual streak, hard work ethic, was born in Plymouth, Michigan to a very impoverished family. In fact, never had a lot of respect for his dad because his dad could never get his act together. And Russell grew up in Michigan, then went off to Michigan State on a full scholarship. He actually, as a sophomore in college, he had one of his academic essays published in an academic journal. They were so convinced he was a professor, even though he was 19 at the time, that they actually put the label on it, associate professor of history, Russell Kirk, at Michigan State. You can imagine what some of his professors thought of that. They were not so impressed with that. But he had published at that time. He then worked for Ford for a little bit as an accountant, then went off. He was drafted in World War II, and he served faithfully out in the Utah desert dealing with chemical weapons and biological weapons as an agent out there in the 1940s, but again, as a member of the U.S. military. When he went off to get his PhD, he came back to Michigan State, and he was absolutely horrified by what he saw at Michigan State. He had gone there as an undergraduate when it was still Michigan State College. It's now becoming Michigan State University, and as he called it, it is essentially Behemoth University. There's nothing personal anymore. This is a colossal institution that is only bureaucratic. It has no purpose to exist except to exist. Students are no longer the focus. They are a means to the longevity of this university. And professors are teaching not because they believe it, but because they're being paid and because they can pack as many students as possible into a classroom and teach them what to believe. And his argument was that it's no accident that we see this massive growth of the university system at the same time that we see the real loss of education. That is, there's no purposeful education going on. If you have 150 students in your classroom, you are not going to have a serious intellectual discussion about a text. It is not possible. You can only tell them what to think and what to believe. And that's it. This is the limitation. There is no real exchange of ideas. There is no great conversation. It is merely, I tell, you repeat. And do you learn it? Probably, for the final. And of course, I'm sure we've all had those experiences. How many of us went into finals where, of course, for the 3 days before, we crammed. And, me going to Notre Dame, maybe I'd go down to the grotto and say Hail Mary or something. I'm not sure they always worked. Maybe that would go over well at Colorado Christian, right? Don't ask Mary for these things. But I mean, it was really interesting, right? These kind of last minute, trying to figure these things out. I learned it. And then, of course, as soon as I passed and did well, I forgot it promptly, and I went on to the next subject, and it was done. And that's a dangerous thing. That's part of the new system. That's part of this constant movement of students in and out. So this is what Kirk said. And so by the way, this is where he made a stand. In the fall of 1953, being a tenured professor there at Michigan State, when he said, I have great objections to this, we can't teach it this way, and he was very civil about it. Kirk was not an uncivil man in any way. In fact, he defined in some very odd ways civility. But he said very clearly, this is where I stand. And the administration wouldn't back down, Kirk wouldn't back down, and he quit. And it made national news. It was because he had made his reputation already as the author of The Conservative Mind. And here he was saying to one of these brand new major universities, right, it had been a long time college, but here it is this new behemoth university. He was done. And it was a shock, an absolute shock. And what does this mean? What's going to happen if our professors start doing this? He gave up tenure. That's not supposed to happen, right? We give them tenure so they get comfy, and that's part of that is that's a trade-off. We hope that when they have tenure, they won't do a lot, but they won't criticize us either. And that's kind of the administration's view. Not here, I'm sure, but at a lot of places. Kirk wouldn't play along. So this is what he writes in his response to this. His whole book, really, in many ways, is a justification for what he did. But he says, I am convinced that academic freedom is truly a thing apart. It is different and particular, and we would be foolish to confound it with the vaguer term intellectual freedom. Intellectual freedom is chiefly an aspiration. It can be sought after most of the time only by the solitary man of contemplation. Academic freedom is a historical reality. With true limits, true prerogatives, it must be preserved and extended, but only when we understand it intelligently and not reflexively. Now, that's a very interesting statement, and let's think about that for a moment. How often, when we hear the question of, has somebody violated tenure, is there a question of academic freedom? It is an instinctive reaction. It is visceral. Well, how dare you tell me what I can or can't say? It's an immediate question, and it may be a very relevant question, but it's an immediate question. Kirk is suggesting that there is actually a very long tradition of this in the West, in Western civilization, and that the development of philosophy in ancient Greece is tied dramatically to the ideal that we as free women and men have the right to challenge our God King. We have the right, being there in Persia, right, Xerxes or Darius, we have the right to challenge those who would teach us what to think on the level of our consciousness, on the level of our conscience, right? Not just a fact, but an actual idea, a belief, something that can be ascertained. And of course, we know what, think about the heroes of Western civilization. And I taught 2 classes today at CU, and I was thinking about this. This was kind of accidental, it just popped up. But I told my students, I'm teaching an honors course on what Western civilization means. And I said, all right, we're not even going to jump really into the Christian tradition yet, because I want to make this as applicable to everyone here as possible. I said, let's just think about the foundation. I'll pick 3 people that I think truly represent the Western tradition. Socrates, who taught adamantly, you never have the right to do harm to another person, no matter the circumstances. Now, we could agree or disagree with that, but that's pretty serious. You never have the right to harm another person, never. You can never do evil in the name of good. You can never do wrong, calculated, in the name of good. It will always end in an evil or a perverted good. It will never end in a good. That's really interesting. And then I brought up Cicero, great Roman Republican, who said, our allegiance must always be to humanity, not to the soil in which we live. Now that's interesting. Soil's important, very important. It's a means to an end. It's what allows us to live, but it is only a means to an end. It must be for something higher. And I ask us just to think about the American founding. To think about George Washington in his first inaugural message, where he said, any nation that ignores the eternal rights of order has no prerogative to live. It deserves its fate to die. Now that's what's Washington saying. He says, I speak to my countrymen, capital C. The American soil is humanity. That's what we believe in. It didn't matter if it happened in Boston or Philadelphia or if it happens in Longmont, Colorado. If it's good, it's good. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's on the Tiber or if it's on the Thames or if it's on the Hudson or if it's on the Potomac or if it's on the Arkansas. If it's good, it's good. If it's true, it's true. It cannot be harmed if it's true. It can be forgotten. It can be ignored. It can be mocked. But it will always be there because it's true. This is the Ciceronian idea. And of course, when we look at our founding fathers, I assume this is fairly common knowledge, almost every one of our founding fathers was absolutely fluent in Greek and Latin by the time they were 14. When they went off to college at age 14, their entrance requirements were exams in Greek and Latin to translate St. John, to translate Virgil, and to translate some of the Greek texts. That's what their entrance exam was. In fact, these would take days. You had to translate the first 3 books of the Aeneid. This is 1,800 lines of Latin that you would have to translate into Greek back into English in order to be even considered for admittance in one of the 9 colleges in America at that time. Who was the person they looked to most? When they found the American Republic, they looked to Cicero. Nobody is more cited in the founding period of the ancient world than Cicero. And then the third person I brought up to my students today was someone that we may or may not be familiar with. She's one of my heroes in history. 19-year-old, pregnant, young Roman noble woman who's converted to Christianity, who accepts martyrdom in the Roman arena rather than give up her belief. This is Perpetua. And I thought about that. All right, what do we have here? You think about these 3 figures in the Western tradition. Socrates, never do harm. Cicero, always put humanity and the good above your immediate expediency. And Perpetua, it's worth dying for the right things. But then it hit me, and this is what hit me so hard today as I was teaching to my students. I said, Look at the result of each of these people. The Athenians killed Socrates. Mark Antony didn't just kill Cicero. He had his men hold Cicero down on the ground while they sawed his head off. And then they brought his head back to the Roman Senate and put it on the podium, where Mark Antony gave a speech then with the head right there. And Mark Antony gave a speech declaring the old republic dead and the new republic born. And of course he means the empire. That's an incredible moment. And Perpetua, 19-year-old girl massacred in the arena. Now, what a dour thing to think about. All of my heroes are martyrs. Well, we can't do that either, right? We would not have a society left if that was everything. But again, what amazing people. People who taught us dramatically what it means to live the good life and to die the good death. To be happy at the moment of our death, even as a bloody mess, because we did the right thing. Our soul was intact, even though our body wasn't. And this is what Kirk is giving us. When we look at the bigger scheme of history, we have these incredible examples. We can see these people throughout history, these people who have energized not just their own societies. Where would the church be without the martyrs? Where would they be? Where would our Christian church, for those of us of the Christian faith, where would it be? Think about all the thousands of people who were massacred in the Roman arenas, and ultimately to good effect. It's terrible to think about, but ultimately to good effect. And I think that we can ask today, this is, great scholarship has been done. You look at the last 100 years. You count up everybody who was killed in the gulags, in the Holocaust camps, in the killing fields. We're approaching, as far as we know, just in the 20th century, 205 million people being executed by their own governments. Now just imagine that for a moment. The U.S. population's right around 315 million. Imagine if 2 out of every 3 people you knew were gone. That's the death rate of the 20th century. Warfare, which is going to be horrific in itself, but of course is necessary and just at times. But warfare took 50 million lives. Governments killed 205 million people. Warfare killed 50. That's interesting. The greatest killer of the 20th century was not war. As horrible as war was, the state killed 4 times the number of people. So this question, these things we're talking about, the left, the right, these are not merely academic questions. These matter. Do we fall into a pattern of conformity, or do we resist? And when we resist, how do we do it wisely? Do we do it in a manner that is effective? Do we do it in a manner that is just? Do we do it in a manner that is right? These are the kinds of things that a young Kirk had to ask himself when he lost his job, by his own decision. When he went out on his own and decided to make his life as a writer and as a lecturer, saying, I'm not going to be a part of academia anymore. After he left Michigan State, the University of Chicago 3 times offered him a professorship. He refused to take it. He'd had his job. He'd done what he needed to do in academia. He did not want to have that kind of security again. He thought it would lessen him. He didn't want to be under someone. He didn't want to be a part of a group, even at a place as great as Chicago. So this is what he says on the next page. And I love the way he writes about these things. He says, we have to understand that real academic freedom is never about anything except the pursuit of the capital T truth. The pursuit of truth puts upon us, as those who claim to be its followers, the gravest of responsibilities. Now again, let me take that back to America again. Anybody who goes back and reads the very beautiful speeches of George Washington, and one thing I get frustrated with, I love Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They were so good that we often think Washington wasn't that good. Forget Adams and Jefferson for a moment. Just don't even consider them. Just pick up any speech by George Washington and read it. It's gorgeous. It's just when he's next to Jefferson, of course he looks like a kid. Anybody looks like a kid next to Jefferson. But think of him by himself for a moment. And what does he say? America now carries the responsibility of Republican government entirely upon her shoulders for the next 1,000 years. Now, what does that mean? That could breed arrogance. My gosh, how great are we? We can do anything we want. It's not what Washington meant. He said, do you realize you have the responsibility of carrying this thing and making it work? And if you mess it up, it's over. It's going to be another 1,000 years. And I'm reminded, I don't know how many of you have read, and I assume here quite a few of you, but how many of you have read the Narnia Tales by Lewis? You remember in one of the Narnia Tales where dreams all come true. And at first, all the men, when they find this out, they say, don't you understand? The dreams, they come true. And the main character says, think about that. Your dreams come true. Well, I can tell you what I dreamt last night, I hope never comes true. It was not a fit. I had a fitful sleep last night. I don't know why. Maybe nervousness about first day of classes. But sometimes dreams are not good. Right? And this is something, there's this responsibility here. And this is what Washington is saying about us. This is what Kirk is saying about those of us who go into the classroom. The worst thing I could do, right, left, center, the absolute worst thing I could do as a professor would be to walk in and expect my students to be mini Brad Birzers at the end of the semester. It would be diabolic. I mean, absolutely diabolic. Think about this just from a theological perspective for a moment. You know, what does God do when he creates us? He creates every single one of us in his infinite image. We are never to be repeated. Ever. We're it. We are the one reflection of that aspect of God. It's it, the imago Dei that we carry, never to be repeated again. There is no repetition, ever. Right? What were you saying? If we have two people who have the exact same opinions, one of them is unnecessary? Well, there's a reason we are radically diverse from one another. And yet, that core of humanity stands. And so this responsibility, if I go into the classroom, this is the same as a father. It's the same as a friend. The thing that we do is never conform those who trust us. Never. We teach them what we believe to be true, but the most important thing is we teach them to question, to think about what matters, so that when they go into a new situation, it's not just like what we saw in the exams where we repeat back to the professor. When you go into a situation and you're in business or you're in the military and you have to make a quick decision, it can't just be, well, of course, this is what I've been told to think. That spark of conscience has to arise in us. And we have to ask, is this a just order? Is this the right thing to do? It doesn't matter if we're in politics or in academia, but Kirk here is dealing specifically, and we're in an academic setting here. What is the question for us in the classroom? What is our job? So the number one thing those of us who proclaim to teach do is we pursue the capital T truth. And that puts upon us very grave responsibilities. But they need not always remember that it is the truth they worship. This is what we believe in. We do not worship humanity, and we certainly do not worship the crowd. We understand that truth has an ultimate source. And if philosophers are treated merely as servants, even as the servants of a faceless community, presently they will acquire the vices of servants, and there will be few redeeming virtues of loyalty to persons. All scholarship, Kirk says, every philosopher in the academy, we must be dedicated men. We must dedicate ourselves completely to the capital T truth. Now, that's a difficult thing. And this is where, when you asked me to speak on this topic tonight, this is what is so interesting to me. Even at a place like Hillsdale, which is pretty much self-selected, and the kinds of students we get, often homeschooled students, students who come from deeply religious backgrounds, even they, when they come, one of the things, and Katie and the others can tell you I do this, on the opening day I ask my students, tell me the 7 virtues. Oh, so, wait, what? You mean like happiness? I was like, no, that's not a virtue. We can pursue happiness, but that's not a virtue, right? And then a few of them will be kind of, well, like faith, hope, and love. Yeah, not just like, but actually faith, hope, and love, right? Those are the highest ones. But what about the pagans? Long before we saw that in Christianity, we had prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude. And one of the most interesting things, looking back at the great Greek philosophers, at Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, what do they say? I, Brad, or insert your own name, right? They weren't thinking about me. That I, whomever. Yes, I absolutely accept that there is an ideal form of justice. Am I right about it? No, I'm not God. Do I have a hint of it? Of course. I'm made in the image of a divine. Even the pagans understood that. Socrates, some of you may know in his dialogue, The Crito, it's beautiful. He has a dream. Here's a dream we wouldn't mind being real. He has a dream as he's in prison. His good friend Crito, best friend, comes to him and says, we've got to get you out of here. We're going to break you out and get you to one of the other Greek city-states. And Socrates says, no worries. I had a dream last night. This beautiful woman in white told me that in 3 days I would be in heaven. Is that our first image of Socrates? Right? When we think of Socrates, we think of the great mind and rationality. Here he's saying to his friend, oh no, I was told. It's okay. Yeah, no problem. 3 days. And that's interesting in and of itself. Right? But 3 days here. There we go. I'll be fine. So even they understood. So yes, I have an inkling of what justice is. And John and I may argue, and as good men of goodwill, dedicated to pursuing truth, he and I may each have very different visions of what justice is. But in the end, we recognize that it's probably greater than either of us can decide. That's the idea of objectivity. It's not that we know everything. It's that we know that there isn't everything to know. We just don't know it yet. And maybe we never will, because we're not God. We're pieces. We have pieces of the puzzle, but we do not have the whole thing. That's the idea that we see stressed here by Kirk. So Kirk tells us, he says, what do we find? Well, no matter when you look at history, in the classical world or in the medieval world, the classical world, the medieval world, the academy always possessed the freedom unknown to other corporate bodies, because persons there, whether philosopher, scholar, or student, were looked upon as men who had been consecrated to the service of truth in the way that a soldier is consecrated in the service of protection. Now that's amazing. And what do I find with my students? And I don't know if this is true here at Colorado, but I find it at Hillsdale as well as at CU. I tell students there's an absolute truth. Their immediate reaction is, oh, no. I've got my opinion, you've got your opinion. And that's, this is very different from when I was a kid. I mean, at least then, and of course I had Dominican nuns. They were quite fierce about what truth was. And I still have both dreams and nightmares about that. But they were quite fierce about that. And I'm glad, but I'm amazed. And here's what's interesting. So I'll tell students, well, this is what Socrates believed. Really? Interesting. Well, what happened to him? Well, he died for his beliefs. He did? It's amazing how interested they are. They are so sick and tired of platitudes. They want to search for something deeper, and they long to hear stories of greatness. They long for it, no matter how cynical of a generation our college students are. At the core, they want truth. And it's very interesting. And they may disagree with you, and that's great. Needs to be there. You've got to have good debate. Socrates, this is the reason everything he did was in a dialogue. He wanted this to be a conversation. And it's a conversation that's not just right now. Here we are 2,400 years after Socrates died. We're still talking about him in a place he could never even have imagined existing, here on the front range of the Rocky Mountains. How bizarre is that? 2,500, and all we have are the notes of his students. We have the notes of Plato and one other figure, Aristophanes. That's all we have. And yet, we know more about Socrates than probably any other man of his generation. Who would have thought that? Would he have thought that? No, he didn't write this stuff down. He's just a voice. He's one of many. And yet here we are still talking about him. We still talk about Cicero. Not a lot. Not as much as we should. We still talk about him. The founders talked about him. One of the great founders, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, when he was asked, he died at age 95 in 1832, November 14th of 1832. But when he was asked right before he died, well, all your friends are dead. Jefferson's dead. Adams is dead. Washington is long dead. Who do you talk to? And he pointed to two books. Scripture. He said, I talk to Jesus every day. It's my favorite. And as soon as I'm done with that, I talk to Cicero. His other book, Cicero on Friendship. He said, Cicero and I have talked for 94 years. That's how they thought of this. And think about, when we look at Washington, and let's look at it ideally for a moment, not all the corruption, but what it's meant to look like. Don't we wonder about this? We look at the architecture, which almost every state legislature, with the exception of Nebraska and North Dakota, have replicated, and that's fine. Good little Midwestern individualism, right? But they've all replicated. Think about what Congress looks like. It's not the Taj Mahal. It's not Parliament. It's not a European cathedral. It's not Timbuktu, not the Hanging Gardens. It is a Roman Republican building. That's very intentional. You know, when we look at our dollar bill, when we look at our seals of the United States, you know, think about Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. That's the opening line to one of Virgil's poems. And very interestingly, Virgil, one of the great Romans, when he writes this, Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages, what follows, written in 44 BC. Now think about that date for a moment. He says, what is the new order of the ages? It is when the God of gods has relations with a virgin, sends his only son to the earth to redeem all corruption. 44 BC. Now, when the founders say the Novus Ordo Seclorum, what are they thinking? The new order of the ages, right? What is America? Well, we're not the Messiah, but we've got these duties. And that is very, very telling. So let me turn to one thing here. And I'll close here in a moment. We can open this up to conversation. But I wanted to bring in a couple of things. I had mentioned to you that when the founding fathers went to college at age 14, they had to translate the first 3 books of the Aeneid, of Virgil's Aeneid. This is 1,800 lines of very complicated Latin poetry that they had to translate first into Greek and then back into English. This would take days to be able to do this. Right? An entrance exam was not the 4-hour SAT. You know, this was a week of translation in front of some very stern taskmaster. And we don't often keep this in mind, but up until the 1850s, all education at any school was only Latin and Greek. You might get a little mathematics, but it was Latin and Greek. And that was it. You know, you were expected. There's no reading, writing, and arithmetics in the schools. That's what your parents are supposed to do. You learn that at home, specifically the mother tongue. You learn that usually in a very good Protestant country. You learn that from your father reading scripture on Sunday morning. That's how you're lettered. This is a reason so many people in the 19th century sound like walking King James Bibles. Right? That's what they know. That's their language. But if they went to school at all, and it didn't matter if they went for 2 years or if they went for 10 years, they were taught Greek and Latin. And it was all up to, we have the stories of the school marms, but it was up to the taskmaster. It was up to the headmaster who would determine if you're going to be there 7 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours. Our idea of what we call public education did not start until Ulysses S. Grant. That is the origin, and then it takes a different shape under the Progressive period in World War I. But let me just jump here for a moment. I want to read something to you, one of my favorite passages. This is not in the first 3 books. It's actually book 8 of the Aeneid, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this story. It's a great story. You can actually, I've got the newest, this is the Penguin version that has been translated by Robert Fagles, and I promise you, if you just get the Audible book, go to audible.com, download the Audible book. I listen to this constantly in my car. It is a beautiful story. There's a reason it's considered one of the 3 or 4 greatest stories in the history of the world. This is not, I'm sorry to my wife, I find Jane Austen so dreadful and so boring. This is great adventure. This is the story of the fall of Troy and the very few Trojans who remain after they've been decimated by the Greeks, trying to replant their culture. And of course, they ultimately replanted in Rome, and they believe that this is the foundation of Rome, of the Republic, and later the Empire. And this is seen to them as a very good thing. But I want you to remember, this is the text that the Americans read probably more than any other text in their education. This would have been absolutely a central part of what they learned. So I'm going to read from book 8. And there's a long, complicated, we've got gods running around and fates, storms. There's a Carthaginian queen who falls in love with Aeneas. When she jilts him, Dido, when she jilts him, she then becomes a witch and curses him, and then she commits suicide. I mean, it's great, right? It's not very PG, but just great stuff. So I want to give you, this is after the god, Jupiter, has betrayed Aeneas. He's promised him something, and then because his wife and his daughter have fought, I'm sure many of us fathers have experienced this before, not me, of course, but I'm sure there are many of us. When there's disagreement, we just kind of stand back and let our wife and our daughter take care of it. But Venus, the daughter, decides, goddess of love, she decides, no, this is not, I'm not going to let this stick. My dad did the wrong thing. I'm going to fix this. And so she decides that she is going to give a suit. This is about 36 BC that this is written. She's going to give a suit of celestial armor to Aeneas. But the goddess Venus lustrous among the cloud banks, bearing her gifts, approached. And when she spotted her son alone, off in a glade's recess by a frigid stream, she hailed him, suddenly there before him. Look, just forged to perfection. By all my husband's skill, these are the gifts I promised. There's no need now, my son, for you to flinch as you're fighting those swaggering Latin ranks. And with that, Venus reached to embrace her son and set the brilliant armor down before him under a nearby oak tree. Now, I want you to keep that image in mind for a moment, the oak tree. And I want you to think about what that symbolizes, and I'm going to come back to that, especially for us as Americans. Aeneas takes delight in the goddess's gifts and the honor of it all. As he runs his eyes across them piece by piece, he cannot get enough of them. He is filled with wonder. He turns them over now with his hands, now his arms, the terrible crested helmet, plumed and shooting fire, the sword blade honed to kill, the breastplate, solid bronze, blood red and immense, like a dark blue cloud inflamed by the sun's rays and gleaming through the heavens. And then the burnished greaves of electrum, the smelted gold of the spear and the shield, the workmanship of that shield. No words could ever explain its power. For there upon the shield was written the story of Italy, of Rome in all of her triumphs. For there the fire god had forged them, well aware of the seers, schooled in the times to come, all in order, the generations who were to be born, all those who had yet to exist in this world. There's the whole future history of Rome written upon it. Now, I ask you, here we are at Colorado Christian. What does that passage sound like? What does it sound like? Yes. Is this not Ephesians 6? Here we have Ephesians and the idea of celestial armor, the sword of the Spirit, right? These things to withstand the darts of the enemy, right? All of this right here in Ephesians. It's an amazing story. And of course, we may know this, but Paul, many people believe that he probably corresponded with one of the great students of Virgil, and that was Seneca. Many people thought that. And for those of you who come from a Calvinist background, what was John Calvin's first book? It was on the philosophy and poetry of Seneca. Right? There's a very strong, think about when Paul goes to Mars Hill. What does he tell them? He says, very, very clearly, we will look at this unknown God through him, with him, in him, through his being, right? This whole idea of what is this, right? This hymn that we have. There's a very long tradition and heritage of this, very long tradition. And Paul, we think of him as being very Hebraic. Remember, he was also very Greek, and he was very Roman as well. And there is a continuity in these things. So what do we have here? What does this mean for us? I want to come back to this idea of Washington, and I want to come back to end here with this idea of the oak tree and what that stands for. In the oak tree, we have this great image. You may know this. The oak tree was, in pagan symbolism, always the symbol of the god of thunder. And specifically in Norse mythology, it was the god of Thor. Right? It was Thor, the god of thunder. This was his symbol. And we know that it was very typical for the Germanic tribes to worship around an oak tree. But we also know, when we get to the first great Christian king in England, when we get to Alfred, he is the first person to write down the common law. Things that we still to this day in America hold sacred. This is the Magna Carta comes out of this. The Declaration comes out of this tradition. Common law, things such as we are innocent until proven guilty. We have the right to a trial by jury. Well, in his own writings, Alfred tells us that he and his men would sit down under the oaks, and there they would examine what they had inherited from their ancestors, and they would decide, do they have the right to pass that on or not? And Alfred says, I never as king would presume I can make these laws. Never. No king makes laws. Kings can only judge if those laws are good and whether those laws should be passed on to the next generation or not. These things are rooted in tradition. They're rooted in community, and our whole understanding of common law is rooted in that. Well, just a personal story. My wife and I, as you heard, live in Hillsdale, Michigan for most of the time. We live on the very northern edge of Hillsdale Township. We're the very last house, actually, legally in Hillsdale. And across the street from us is a beautiful, gorgeous, called Oak Grove Cemetery, 19th century cemetery, which has in that cemetery over 300 Civil War veterans. Michigan. These are hardcore guys. These are guys who signed up on day one of the Civil War, many of them coming from Hillsdale College. In fact, 492 of the 500 men at Hillsdale enrolled on the first day, joined up, volunteered. And many of them lost their lives on the first and second days at Gettysburg. An incredible story. But from our driveway, and I love this, we can see the grave of someone you've never heard of. I guarantee you there's not a person in this room, with the exception of maybe John, who's ever heard of this person. First historian at Hillsdale College, a guy who was also a minister by the name of Ransom Dunn. And we can see his grave right from our house, just a few feet, actually, from our driveway. We go over there quite a bit. Now, who was Ransom Dunn? In 1854, he was furious because of a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that would allow for people living right here to vote and to decide by majority vote if a state could be free or slave. So you can't do that. It's not up to a democratic process. You cannot determine if a man is a slave by a mere vote. It has to be based on something higher than that. And Ransom Dunn went up to Jackson, Michigan, and under a grove of oak trees, with a couple of other men, several of them from Hillsdale College, founded the Republican Party. And why did they call themselves Republican? Because they were going back to the founding, and their argument was, if we are to believe in intellectual truth, if we are to believe in what is good, what is true, we have to act this out. It is not enough to be about a politics of efficacy. It must be a politics of principle. And whatever the Republican Party has become, that's not a bad way to start. You want to start by saying, you can't do this. You can't enslave a man. No. You better explain exactly why if you're going to do that. And it can't just be because the majority of you think we should do it. No, that's not possible. You cannot do that. And yet, where do they meet? Under that oak tree. Under the oak tree, that great pagan symbol which has been Christianized over the ages, which has become a part and parcel of who we are. So let me take that back to Kirk. Let me take that back to us as Americans. What is our point here? We ask this question, how much does the left control? Well, they control a lot. And when we look at places like academia, they have an almost ironclad grasp on things. But this is the good news. They don't know why they believe it anymore. They don't understand it. They haven't thought about it. They don't know about the principles of it. They believe it because they were told to believe it, and they chose not to think about it. That's where they're at right now. They are not based on anything, and students are not fooled. When students come in, they learn what they have to learn because they know they have to be able to get away with it. But when they have the chance, they jump at intellectual discussion. They jump at ideas that are older than yesterday. They care about things that really, really matter. And what happens? There's a huge change between an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old. And there are a few places like Colorado Christian, places like Hillsdale, a few places at Notre Dame, University of Dallas, St. Thomas, a couple of others, that are fighting this. But this is the interesting thing. We know that colleges are almost untenable at this point. They have gone into debt. They are reliant almost completely on public monies. There is going to be a massive change coming. It will make the housing market look small with the implosion we saw in 2008, because we're not just talking about economics here. We're talking about our very cultural capital. And those people who are in place at this moment to teach real education, those people who believe in truth, will come out of this. Partly because they have something to believe in and they have something to teach. They have something worthwhile. And I'm not knocking people I meet at Colorado who teach engineering or physics. We've we've got 5 Nobel Prize winners at Colorado. It's great. When I'm in an airplane, I could care less if the pilot has read his Plato. I hope he's studied engineering and aerodynamics. And when I go into surgery, if I'm conscious, let's hope not, but I'm hoping that the doctor, I hope he took his Hippocratic oath. But I'm also hoping he understands how my brain works. That's very important to me. But there comes a point where you teach and train all the technicians in the world. And then the question comes, well, we're in charge and we've got a Jewish body here. It's 1943. What are you going to do with it? Scientific curiosity. You can do whatever you want to it. There's no real morality anymore, is there? There's only power. There comes that question. We're not there yet in America. There are places, we've been there at times with eugenics and other things we've done to African Americans, to the mentally retarded. Incredible, horrific things we've done to American Indians, to the unborn. We've done horrific things. But we're not at that level where we're quite where the Nazis were or where the Stalinists were. But we have to beware. And if we don't allow for academic freedom, if we don't seek that truth, what's our generation going to be based on? What's their belief except getting ahead, learning what they need to learn, and moving on, and making some advantage for themselves? That's not America. It's not what we were based on. It's not the West. Perpetua did not stand up in front of the Romans and say, I'm going to die here because I believe in the Roman state and they have every right to do what they want to me. She died because it was the right thing to do. She had a baby. She would have given anything to have had a normal motherhood, to have raised her child. Cicero didn't want to die. He didn't want his head sawed off. He didn't want to be a prop for Mark Antony. Socrates didn't want to die. But it comes. And when it comes, as it will for all of us, you either go out well or you go out poorly. Probably one of the few choices in life that will ever really, really matter that we make. It's really important. So what do we ask? Does the left have control? Yeah. Will they 20 years from now? I'm not so sure. I think they're in their last days. They have no imagination. They have no social capital. They only have power. And at some point, power just doesn't work. We've seen that over and over again. Thank you very much.